Let me start by challenging one of the most painful assumptions people make after an avoidant pulls away. They stopped being attracted to me. That conclusion feels logical because their behavior changes. They become colder. Their communication decreases. The affection that once felt natural suddenly feels forced. They stop initiating. They create distance. And because we tend to interpret behavior as a direct reflection of feeling, we immediately assume they must not want me anymore. But human psychology is more complicated than that. Attraction and emotional capacity are not the same thing. A person can be deeply attracted to you and still be incapable of maintaining the intimacy that attraction creates. In fact, sometimes the very thing that draws an avoidant toward you can eventually activate the defenses that make them run. Think about what attraction actually does. It brings someone closer. It increases emotional exposure. It creates vulnerability. You begin to matter. Your opinion matters. Your presence matters. Your absence starts to matter. And for someone who has learned to protect themselves through emotional distance, that can become psychologically threatening. This is where you have to stop looking only at what they did and start asking what the relationship was demanding from them emotionally. Because keeping you wasn't simply about continuing to feel attracted to you. Keeping you meant tolerating vulnerability. It meant communicating when things became uncomfortable. It meant allowing another person to influence their emotional world. It meant staying present during conflict instead of escaping. It meant being consistent even when closeness triggered fear. And that is a completely different psychological task. An avoidant person may be perfectly capable of experiencing desire. They may enjoy the excitement of pursuit, the chemistry, the novelty, the emotional intensity of getting close. But when the relationship moves from attraction into attachment, the rules change. Now you aren't simply someone they desire, you are someone who can affect them. And that is precisely where their internal defenses can become activated. Suddenly, closeness doesn't just feel good, it feels dangerous. Dependence becomes frightening. Expectations feel restrictive. Emotional conversations feel overwhelming. The relationship starts requiring a level of psychological participation that their old coping mechanisms were never designed to handle. So they retreat. And here's the distinction I want you to remember. Retreat does not always mean absence of feeling. Sometimes it means inability to tolerate the feeling. That's a profound difference. But don't misunderstand this. Understanding their psychology does not mean excusing their behavior. You can understand why someone withdraws and still recognize that withdrawal hurts you. You can understand their fear without volunteering to become the person who manages that fear for them. Because love is not simply about what someone feels internally. Love becomes meaningful through what someone is capable of doing with those feelings. That's why you must never reduce your value to another person's emotional limitations. If someone walks away because intimacy requires more capacity than they currently possess, that does not prove you were too much. It may simply reveal that the relationship demanded something from them they had not yet learned how to provide. And this is where your perspective has to change. Stop asking, what did I do to make them lose attraction? Start asking, what did this relationship require from them that they were not emotionally equipped to sustain? That question moves you from self-blame to understanding. And once you understand that distinction, you stop chasing an explanation that destroys your self-worth. They didn't necessarily stop feeling for you. They may have reached the limits of what they were capable of giving. And your worth was never measured by their capacity. And once you understand that distinction, we can go one level deeper. Because sometimes the most powerful thing about a relationship isn't that you made someone feel good. It's that you made them feel something they could no longer avoid. Think about that. There are people who can move through life without ever having to confront the deepest parts of themselves. They keep relationships at a comfortable distance. They reveal just enough, but never too much. They enjoy connection, but maintain an escape route. They can tell themselves they're independent, self-sufficient, and perfectly fine alone. Then someone comes along who doesn't simply admire the surface. Someone who notices. Someone who remembers. Someone who asks questions that cannot be answered with a joke, silence, or a change of subject. And suddenly, the relationship becomes a mirror. That is what emotional intimacy does. It doesn't merely give you another person to love. It exposes the parts of yourself you have spent years protecting. For an avoidant, that can create a profound internal conflict. On one side, there is attraction, curiosity, affection, and the desire to be close. On the other side, there may be a deeply conditioned fear that closeness equals vulnerability, vulnerability equals dependence, and dependence eventually leads to pain, rejection, disappointment, or loss of control. So the person who once felt comforting can eventually become psychologically confronting, not because they became worse, because they became more important, and importance creates vulnerability. This is why you have to understand something that most people miss. The more emotionally significant you become, the more powerful their defenses may become if those defenses were built around avoiding emotional exposure. They don't necessarily run because you failed to create connection. Sometimes they run because you succeeded. You reached a place inside them that casual relationships never reached, and now they have a decision to make. They can stay and become more emotionally honest, or they can retreat into the identity that has protected them for years. That's where the internal conflict begins. Because part of them may genuinely want you, while another part is screaming, "Get away before this becomes too important." And this is why their behavior can seem irrational. One day they're warm, attentive, and emotionally engaged, then suddenly they're distant. They may seem confused about what they want. They may create unnecessary space. They may convince themselves that the relationship is moving too quickly, that they need freedom, or that something about the connection just doesn't feel right. But sometimes what doesn't feel right isn't the person, it's the vulnerability. And there's a philosophical lesson here that extends far beyond avoidant attachment. People don't always run from what they dislike. Sometimes they run from what they cannot yet handle. That's an important distinction. But again, understanding does not mean tolerating everything. You are not responsible for becoming someone's emotional therapist. You cannot love someone into emotional readiness. You cannot provide enough reassurance to permanently remove defenses they haven't chosen to confront themselves. Your role is not to prove that intimacy is safe. Your role is to remain honest about what you require from a relationship. Because eventually, every relationship asks the same question. Can both people remain present when the relationship becomes emotionally real? Attraction can start the journey. Chemistry can intensify it. But capacity determines whether someone can actually stay. So if they pulled away after becoming deeply connected to you, don't automatically assume that you weren't enough. Maybe you simply reached the place where attraction stopped being enough and emotional courage became necessary. You didn't necessarily awaken their rejection. You awakened their vulnerability. And what they did with that vulnerability was their choice, never your measure of worth. And once you understand that your closeness may have activated something deeper inside them, we arrive at the next uncomfortable truth. Someone can genuinely want a relationship with you and still be incapable of sustaining one. That sounds contradictory, but it isn't. We often confuse desire with capacity. We assume that if someone wants us badly enough, they'll automatically know how to keep us. But human beings don't operate that way. Wanting is emotional. Sustaining is behavioral. Wanting can happen instantly. Capacity has to be developed. An avoidant may want your attention, your affection, your companionship, and even the emotional safety they experience around you. They may miss you when you're gone. They may think about you late at night. They may feel jealous when they imagine you moving forward. They may even recognize that you're one of the most meaningful people they've encountered, and still, they may not know how to maintain closeness. That's the distinction that changes everything. Because a relationship isn't maintained by feelings alone. It's maintained through repeated behaviors, communication, consistency, accountability, emotional availability, repair after conflict, and the willingness to remain present when discomfort appears. And this is where an avoidant pattern can become destructive. When closeness feels good, they can participate. When distance feels safe, they can function. But when the relationship requires them to tolerate emotional discomfort, they may revert to the strategy that has always protected them: withdrawal. The problem is that withdrawal creates exactly what they may fear. They withdraw to escape pressure, but their withdrawal creates insecurity. They create distance to regain control, but the distance damages trust. They avoid difficult conversations to prevent conflict, but avoiding the conversation creates a larger conflict later. And eventually the other person is left asking, how can someone care about me and treat me like I don't matter? Because caring and capacity are different psychological dimensions. Someone can care and still be emotionally immature. Someone can love and still lack relational skills. Someone can feel deeply and still behave inconsistently. That doesn't make the behavior acceptable. It makes the situation understandable. And this is where you need to protect yourself from one of the most dangerous beliefs in relationships If I just love them better, they'll finally become capable of loving me properly. No, you cannot compensate for another person's lack of emotional capacity through an unlimited supply of your own. You can communicate clearly. You can create safety. You can offer patience. You can model healthy vulnerability. But eventually they have to participate in their own growth. Because there comes a point where understanding becomes self-abandonment if you're constantly using psychology to explain away behavior that continues to hurt you. That's why your standard shouldn't simply be, do they have feelings for me? The better question is, can they consistently act in ways that make those feelings safe for me to receive? That's maturity. You aren't looking for someone who merely feels intensely. You're looking for someone who can carry the weight of what they feel. Because anyone can experience attraction. Anyone can miss you. Anyone can have emotional moments. But building a relationship requires something much deeper, the ability to translate emotion into action. And that is why you should never measure the value of a relationship solely by how powerful the feelings were. Measure it by what those feelings produced. Did they communicate? Did they show up? Did they repair? Did they take responsibility? Did they become more emotionally available? Because at the end of the day, feelings may explain someone's behavior, but only capacity determines whether they can build something lasting with you. They may have wanted you deeply, but wanting you was never the same as being ready to keep you. And once you understand that wanting you and being capable of sustaining you are two different things, we can move into an even deeper realization. Sometimes your standards don't destroy a relationship. They reveal the truth about it. Because in the beginning, almost anyone can perform connection. When everything is exciting, when there is chemistry, when there are no difficult conversations, when nobody is asking for much emotionally, it is relatively easy to appear available. You can be affectionate. You can be attentive. You can say all the right things. You can enjoy the closeness without confronting the responsibilities that come with it. But eventually, every meaningful relationship moves beyond chemistry. It asks for consistency. It asks for communication. It asks, can you still show up when you're uncomfortable? And that's where the difference between attraction and capacity becomes impossible to ignore. You may have reached a point where you weren't asking for anything unreasonable. You weren't asking them to become a completely different person overnight. You were asking for basic relational qualities, clarity instead of confusion, consistency instead of unpredictability, communication instead of silence, and mutual effort instead of one-sided emotional labor. But if someone has learned to experience intimacy as a threat to their independence, even healthy expectations can feel enormous. This is where you have to be careful with the story you tell yourself. You might think, maybe I asked for too much. But perhaps you didn't ask for too much. Perhaps you simply stopped accepting too little. That is a completely different statement. And when you stop accepting less than what you need, you force the relationship to reveal itself. There are only two possibilities. The other person grows with you, or they retreat from the standard. If they grow, the relationship becomes stronger. If they retreat, you learn something important. The standard didn't cause the incompatibility. The standard exposed it. Think about that psychologically. A person who is comfortable receiving affection without accountability can remain comfortable as long as the other person keeps adjusting. You become more patient. You lower expectations. You stop bringing up difficult subjects. You accept inconsistent communication. You explain away the disappearing. You convince yourself that their behavior is simply how they are. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin negotiating against yourself. That's where self-abandonment begins. You aren't simply loving another person anymore. You're modifying yourself to make their limitations easier to tolerate. But healthy love should not require you to become smaller. Your standards are not walls designed to punish someone. They're boundaries designed to reveal what kind of relationship you are willing to participate in. And this is especially important when dealing with someone who has avoidant tendencies. Their instinct may be to interpret emotional expectations as pressure. Your desire for clarity may feel like control to them. Your need for consistency may feel like demand. Your desire to resolve conflict may feel like emotional intensity. But their interpretation doesn't automatically make your needs unreasonable. Two people can genuinely care about each other and still have completely different capacities for intimacy. That's painful, but it's liberating once you understand it. Because then you stop trying to win a courtroom argument about who is right. You stop asking, how do I convince them that my needs are valid? You simply recognize, these are my needs. This is their current capacity. What happens next is information. That's emotional maturity. You don't need to demonize them. You don't need to chase them. You don't need to prove your value. And you don't need to lower your standards just because someone becomes uncomfortable when you express them. Your standards are a filter. They reveal who can meet you where you are and who can only love you when you're willing to meet them where they are. And remember, this doesn't mean demanding perfection. Every human being struggles. Everyone has moments of withdrawal, fear, confusion, and emotional limitation. The question is whether they are willing to recognize those patterns and take responsibility for changing them. That's the difference between limitation and growth. Because the person who says, this is difficult for me, but I want to work through it, is demonstrating capacity and development. The person who says, this is difficult for me, therefore you must accept whatever I do, is asking you to carry the entire relationship. And you cannot build intimacy alone. So don't regret having standards. Don't apologize for wanting consistency. Don't interpret someone's retreat as proof that you demanded too much. Sometimes the moment you finally stop accepting crumbs is the moment someone discovers they were never prepared to bring the whole meal. Your standards didn't make you lose them. Your standards revealed whether they were capable of standing beside you. And once your standards have exposed the difference between what someone wants and what they're capable of giving, something very important happens when you stop chasing. The emotional reality of your absence can finally become impossible to ignore. Because when you are constantly pursuing someone, you may unknowingly protect them from experiencing the consequences of their own withdrawal. You send the message first. You explain what went wrong. You ask what they're feeling. You offer reassurance. You give another chance. You try to repair the connection they helped damage. And because you're doing all of this, the avoidant doesn't necessarily have to confront the full emotional impact of creating distance. There is always a bridge back to you. There is always another opportunity. There is always evidence that you're still waiting. But when you stop building that bridge, something changes. Silence becomes information. Distance becomes real. And absence begins to communicate what words could never fully express. Now understand this carefully. Silence should never be used as a manipulation tactic. This isn't about disappearing to make someone panic. It isn't about playing games, creating jealousy, or trying to engineer regret. Real detachment is different. Real detachment says, I care about you, but I will no longer abandon myself to maintain a connection that requires me to do all the emotional work. That distinction is powerful because when you stop chasing, you aren't necessarily trying to make them come back. You're giving yourself back to yourself. And ironically, that's often when the other person can finally perceive what your presence actually meant. Psychologically, people can become accustomed to what is consistently available. When your attention is always there, your emotional support is always there, and your willingness to repair everything is always there, your presence can become part of the background of their emotional world. They know you'll respond. They know you'll care. They know you'll probably forgive. They know the relationship can remain partially alive without requiring them to fully participate. But when you step away, that structure disappears. Now they have to experience the consequences of their own choices. They may begin remembering the conversations they dismissed. They may notice the emotional safety they took for granted. They may think about the moments when you were patient. They may wonder whether you have finally moved on. They may even begin to feel regret. But here is where I want you to remain intellectually honest. Regret is not the same thing as readiness. Missing you is not the same thing as changing. Thinking about you is not the same thing as building a healthy relationship with you. And this is where people get trapped. They see an avoidant return, receive a message, notice renewed attention, and immediately assume they finally understand. Maybe they do, but maybe they simply miss the emotional comfort you provided. Those are not identical things. The real evidence isn't whether they return. The real evidence is whether they return differently. Do they communicate differently? Do they take responsibility? Do they acknowledge the impact of their actions? Do they become more consistent? Do they tolerate difficult conversations instead of escaping them? Do they make space for your needs instead of asking you to suppress them? That's the test. Because anyone can return when they miss someone's presence. Transformation is demonstrated when someone returns with a greater capacity to sustain that presence. And this is where your silence becomes powerful, not because it creates psychological pain in another person, but because it creates psychological clarity for you. When you're no longer chasing, you finally have room to observe. You can stop analyzing every text, stop interpreting every delay, stop wondering what their silence means, stop trying to decode their emotional state. You can simply watch behavior, and behavior gives you information. That is freedom. You don't have to punish them. You don't have to prove a point. You don't have to make them regret losing you. Your job is to become unavailable for relationships that require you to continually betray your own needs. And if your absence causes someone to recognize your value, that's their realization. If your absence causes them to change, that's their work. And if your absence simply allows you to finally heal, that is your victory. Because the goal was never to make someone desperate enough to return. The goal was to become strong enough that you no longer need them to. When you stop chasing, you don't lose your power. You stop giving it away. And sometimes your absence is the first time someone finally understands the value of your presence. And now we arrive at the final and most important realization, because everything we've discussed ultimately comes back to one question. What happens when you stop measuring your worth through another person's capacity to love you? This is where your entire perspective has to change, because when someone pulls away, the mind naturally searches for an explanation. You replay conversations. You analyze your behavior. You wonder whether you were too available, too emotional, too demanding, too independent, or somehow not attractive enough. You start looking for the mistake. But what if there wasn't a mistake? What if the relationship simply reached the point where their emotional capacity could no longer match the depth of the connection? That possibility changes everything. You have to understand that another person's limitations are not an objective measurement of your value. Their inability to communicate does not mean you are unworthy of communication. Their inability to commit does not mean you are unworthy of commitment. Their inability to tolerate intimacy does not mean you are too difficult to love. Sometimes you were simply asking someone to operate at a level they had not developed the capacity to sustain. And that's painful because love makes us want to personalize everything. We think, if they really love me, they would stay. But human beings are not that simple. People can have genuine feelings and still possess destructive patterns. They can care deeply and still sabotage closeness. They can recognize your value and still be unable to participate in a healthy relationship. That's why you must separate someone's feelings about you from their ability to build with you. Feelings are internal experiences. Relationships are lived experiences. And you don't live inside someone's feelings. You live inside their behavior. That's why the question isn't simply, did they love me? The deeper question is, did their behavior create a relationship in which I could feel loved? Those are two completely different questions. And once you understand that, you stop negotiating against yourself. You stop saying, maybe if I become more patient, they'll finally commit. Maybe if I explain myself better, they'll finally understand. Maybe if I give them more space, they'll come back ready. Maybe if I become less emotional, less demanding, less available, less myself, they'll feel comfortable enough to stay. But listen carefully, if someone requires you to become less of yourself in order for them to remain connected to you, the problem isn't that you aren't lovable. The problem is that the relationship has become dependent on your self-abandonment. And that is too expensive a price to pay for connection. You can have compassion for an avoidant person's wounds without volunteering to become wounded by them indefinitely. You can understand their fear without making their fear your responsibility. You can recognize their emotional limitations without turning those limitations into a verdict against yourself. That's emotional sovereignty. And emotional sovereignty means you don't need another person to validate your worth before you believe it. You don't need their regret. You don't need their return. You don't need them to admit they made a mistake. You don't even need them to understand what they lost. Because the moment your self-worth depends on their realization, you've handed them control over your identity. Take that power back. Your value existed before they noticed you. Your value existed while they loved you. Your value existed when they became distant. And your value will exist whether they return or never return. That's the philosophical truth underneath this entire conversation. People come into our lives with different levels of emotional development. Some can meet us deeply. Some can meet us temporarily. Some awaken parts of us and then leave because they were never equipped to remain. That doesn't make the connection meaningless. It means the connection taught you something. Perhaps it taught you what you need. Perhaps it taught you what you will no longer tolerate. Perhaps it taught you the difference between chemistry and compatibility. Perhaps it taught you that being chosen isn't enough. You need to be consistently met. And maybe the greatest lesson is this: you don't need to become easier to lose. You need to become harder to abandon yourself. Because the goal isn't to make an avoidant finally recognize your worth. The goal is for you to recognize it so completely that another person's inability to recognize it no longer destabilizes you. Then something extraordinary happens. You stop chasing, you stop proving, you stop waiting, you stop trying to convince someone to give you what they have repeatedly shown they cannot sustain, and you begin building a life that doesn't depend on someone else's emotional capacity. That's when you become free. So remember this: when someone walks away, their inability to keep you is not evidence that you weren't worth keeping. Sometimes it is simply evidence that they were not ready for the responsibility of having you. And your final lesson is simple: never shrink your worth to fit inside someone else's capacity. So let me bring all of this together. If someone pulled away from you, don't immediately turn their distance into a verdict about your worth. Don't assume that because their behavior changed, your value disappeared. Attraction, love, emotional capacity, and relational maturity are not the same thing. Someone can want you and still be unable to sustain you. Someone can miss you and still be unable to meet your needs. Someone can recognize your value and still lack the courage, emotional skills, or consistency required to build something lasting with you. And that distinction matters because it changes the question you're asking. Instead of asking, "What was wrong with me?" ask, "What was this relationship requiring from them that they were not prepared to give?" Instead of asking, "How do I make them come back?" ask, "Why would I chase someone who has already shown me that they cannot consistently meet me?" Instead of asking, "Do they regret losing me?" ask, "Have they actually developed the capacity to treat me differently?" That is the difference between emotional obsession and emotional wisdom. Because regret is not transformation. Missing you is not commitment. Attraction is not consistency. And a return is not necessarily growth. If they ever come back, don't listen only to their words. Watch what has changed. Watch whether they communicate differently. Watch whether they take responsibility. Watch whether they can tolerate vulnerability without running. Watch whether their actions finally match the feelings they claim to have. And if they don't come back, don't interpret that as proof that you weren't enough. Sometimes people leave because staying would require them to confront parts of themselves they aren't ready to confront. That's their journey, not yours. Your journey is to stop abandoning yourself in an attempt to keep someone else. You don't have to become quieter so someone can tolerate you. You don't have to lower your standards so someone can remain comfortable. You don't have to chase harder. You don't have to prove that you're worthy of commitment. And you certainly don't have to spend your life waiting for someone to develop the capacity to give you what you already know you deserve. You can have compassion for someone's wounds without making those wounds your home. You can love someone and still let them go. You can understand why they ran without running after them. And you can acknowledge that what you shared was real without allowing that reality to keep you trapped in an unhealthy dynamic. Because ultimately, this speech was never about figuring out whether the avoidant still has feelings for you. It was about something far more important. It was about recognizing that your worth is not determined by another person's capacity to hold it. Maybe they didn't lose attraction. Maybe they lost the capacity to keep someone whose presence demanded emotional honesty, consistency, vulnerability, and growth. But here's what matters now. You don't need to become smaller so they can stay. You don't need to become harder so they will chase. You don't need to become indifferent so they will finally value you. You simply need to become deeply committed to yourself. Because the moment you stop asking, "How can I make them choose me?" and start asking, "Does this relationship deserve access to me?" everything changes. That's when you stop chasing validation and start living from self-respect. That's when their distance stops defining you. That's when their silence stops controlling you. That's when their regret or lack of regret stops determining your peace. And that's when you finally understand the deepest truth of all. They didn't determine your value by leaving. They revealed their capacity by leaving. So don't spend the rest of your life trying to convince someone of what they couldn't hold. Build the life, protect the peace, raise the standard, and never again confuse someone's inability to keep you with your inability to be loved. You are not too much. You are simply asking the wrong person to carry something they had never learned how to hold.